In late fall of 1885, Dunwell Valley entered the phase its residents knew all too well. The moment the air turned cold suddenly, wind swept down from the mountain peaks and warned of a winter that could kill in a single night. While every family focused on patching cabin walls, splitting more firewood, and reinforcing roofs, something unusual was happening on the eastern edge of the valley. The elderly widow Eleanor Hargreave, 68 years old, living with her 2 young grandchildren, spent every morning disappearing inside her old livestock barn. From the outside, the barn looked unremarkable. A worn wooden roof, darkened walls, straw piled against the sides. But anyone passing by noticed something strange, the rhythmic thumping under the floor, the slight vibrations, as if something was being moved below. Neighbors began to talk. At the general store, people said, "She's digging her own grave." At church, others shook their heads. An old woman still wanting to dig dirt. One day the barn will collapse. No one understood why. When everyone was preparing for winter, Eleanor was directing all her strength into whatever was forming beneath the barn floor, and she offered no explanation. Few remembered that her husband, Matthew, had once worked in ice houses up north, where ground temperature remained stable regardless of the season. He had told her about a simple principle. 6 feet underground, temperature did not follow storms, was not swayed by wind, did not freeze. It was the level people once relied on to preserve food, keep water from icing, and resist sudden weather changes. Eleanor had heard it hundreds of times, but only after her son's death from the cold the previous winter did those words become a real decision. Now she was applying that knowledge in a way no one in the valley had ever considered. She quietly dug downward, each shovel strike steady. Not out of curiosity, not out of despair, but because she believed the deep earth maintained what wooden cabins could not. A base temperature enough to keep children alive when negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit winds swept down. People looked at the livestock barn and saw only decay. But beneath that thin floor, Eleanor was building a structure she believed would work entirely differently from fireplaces or wind-blocked wood. The coming winter would test everything. And the only question left hanging, like a blade pointed down at the valley, was, could an old widow truly understand something about earth, heat, and survival that the entire valley had overlooked? After her son's death the previous winter, the elderly widow, Eleanor Hargreave, had to carry the full burden of the family, now reduced to just her 2 young grandchildren, Clara and Edwin. Both were frail, prone to colds, and the wooden cabin they lived in, built when her husband was still strong, no longer had the strength to withstand Montana winters. The stove still burned red, firewood was burned constantly, but the heat did not stay. The cabin walls had cracked over time, wind whistled through every wooden seam, and each valley gust sweeping down brought a wave of cold piercing the bedroom, making the 2 children cough harshly all night. The stove was constantly backdrafted by wind. Whenever the direction changed, smoke filled the entire house, forcing Eleanor to open the door, even when it was below 0 degrees Fahrenheit outside. In Dunwell Valley, this was nothing new. Montana winters often dropped to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, or lower, when valley winds piled up between the slopes. Every family that had lived here had stories of nights so cold that a single small mistake, fire going out, smoke backing up, wet firewood, could mean losing someone. Eleanor had lost her son exactly that way. A sudden swirling wind caused the stove to backdraft smoke. The cabin cooled so fast that Jonas could not survive the fever. That obsession had haunted her all year. Then one early winter night this year, when wind again swept down the valley, she saw Clara's lips turn purple, her breathing rapid just like Jonas's final hours. That sight made Eleanor realize that if she relied only on this cabin, she would lose everything. It was then that she heard Matthew's voice in her head again. Her husband, 6 feet underground. It's the same all year. The earth doesn't follow the wind. Those words had once been just professional knowledge he brought back from years working in ice houses, but that night they became an escape. The very next day, as soon as the sun rose, Eleanor began digging a cellar under the livestock barn. No one was to know. She chose the barn because it was more hidden than the cabin, and the sounds of pick and shovel could blend with livestock noises. Each bucket of dirt she scattered behind the garden, mixed into old rocky soil so no one would notice. Valley neighbors were very nosy. If they saw her digging a deep hole, that would be enough for gossip. She knew well. The fewer people who saw, the greater the chance of finishing. In those days, the image of an elderly widow, bent over, hands trembling but still lifting the pick, appeared as sheer stubbornness. Each strike took a portion of her strength, her breathing quick and thin, but her eyes fixed on one direction. Dig deep enough, solid enough, warm enough to keep Clara and Edwin alive through the winter. In the valley, everyone prepared for the cold. Eleanor prepared to defy it in a way no one had ever thought of. Eleanor knew full well she could not fight winter with physical strength, so she chose to rely on what weather could not control: deep ground temperature. Her husband, Matthew, had worked in ice houses and manual cold storage, where people depended entirely on the natural principle. At a depth of about 6 feet, temperature always stayed around 50–55 degrees Fahrenheit, whether the surface was 90 degrees Fahrenheit in summer or -30 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. Deep earth was not chilled by wind, did not fluctuate day to night, did not drop suddenly like wooden cabin walls. Matthew had said, "If you want to fight the weather, use what the weather can't touch: deep earth." That was the technical foundation for the entire shelter Eleanor was building herself. The first task was reaching the stable soil layer. She dug to a depth of 6 feet, measured with an old wooden ruler, ensuring the cellar lay completely in the thermally stable zone. Then she built walls with stone. Stones were stacked thick, about 12–14 inches, creating a layer of thermal mass that absorbed and retained heat. In former ice houses, Matthew had shown her how 14-inch thick walls could hold 40–50 degrees Fahrenheit for days without adding ice. Eleanor applied it almost exactly. Large stones outside, medium stones inside, gaps filled with a dry straw and clay mixture. This was natural insulation, reducing heat loss and preventing cold transmission from the surface ground. The cellar floor had to be dry and free of dampness. Bare soil had 10–20% moisture, easily chilling feet and dampening blankets. She replaced it with flat stone slabs, 2–3 inches thick, with small gravel spread underneath for drainage. This structure kept the floor around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, far more stable than the cabin's wooden floor, which could drop to 35–40 degrees Fahrenheit after just a few hours without fire. The ceiling was what worried her most due to collapse risk. She chose the best remaining timbers on the farm, each 2 inches thick, placed parallel 6–8 inches apart, then braced with cross beams for greater load bearing. The top layer was covered with clay and straw for a 4–5 inch insulation layer. When finished, the ceiling could bear at least 200–250 pounds, enough for the barn floor, straw, and snow not to collapse the cellar. But for the cellar to function, ventilation had to be precise. A sealed cellar would lack oxygen and trap smoke if fire was lit. Eleanor created a simple vent using an old wooden trough about 4 feet long, 3–4 inches in diameter. The lower end opened inside the cellar, the upper end directed out of the barn, sheltered from north wind to avoid direct cold blasts. She even attached a metal flap as an adjustable valve that could be turned to allow 20% to 80% airflow. When testing, she lit a small handful of wood and watched the smoke direction. If smoke rose straight to the ceiling and lingered, she opened the valve another 10%. If smoke drew out too fast, she reduced it to retain heat. To confirm the principles worked, she measured everything with crude tools. The thermometer hung in the cellar always showed 52–55 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the cabin above was only 42 degrees Fahrenheit. A stone block left in a basin overnight tested for condensation. When the stone stayed dry, she confirmed the moisture barrier worked. Burning 1 stick of wood for 20 minutes raised the cellar temperature 2–3 degrees Fahrenheit, proving the stone walls retained and distributed heat well. Eleanor lacked the strength to work fast, but she had meticulous care. Every step was based on numbers, principles, and what she had learned from Matthew. And the more she tested, the more she believed. This 6-foot-deep shelter could do what wooden cabins never had: maintained stable heat, no matter the winter outside preparing to drop to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Rumors about what the elderly widow Eleanor Hargreave was doing under the barn floor spread across Dunwell Valley in just a few days. At church, while everyone was repairing walls for the first seasonal winds, people whispered that she was digging her own grave. At the general store, As women chose flour and dried beans, someone remarked sourly, "Digging dirt to escape winter or to escape life?" At the water pump, where everyone fetched water early in the morning, stories about her were embellished, exaggerated, and became entertainment for the group. No one knew exactly what she was doing, but all were certain of one thing. It was not normal. Marshall Kitteridge, the old farmer living closest to her, was especially worried yet full of suspicion. He saw Eleanor carrying straw and stones into the barn at midday and heard the steady thumping under the floor many times. He came to her door twice to ask, but she only said briefly that she was repairing the barn. Irene Mulvaney, the store owner, raised an eyebrow and half smiled whenever Eleanor bought more nails, rope, or dry straw. Planning to build the whole valley underground? Those seemingly joking words followed Eleanor every time she left the house. Thomas Hale, the 16-year-old boy nearby, chose to spy. He often sat on the fence watching the livestock barn to see if she did anything strange. Many times he even climbed into his own barn loft to look down at her yard, trying to catch the moment she opened the floor hatch. Whenever he saw her hauling stones or straw into the barn, he ran to tell his friends, adding new layers to the rumors. Small confrontations began. One day, Kitteridge blocked her in the yard as she carried a large stone. "The barn will collapse one day, and you'll take the livestock with you," he said without hiding his irritation. Eleanor only lowered her head and said nothing. Another time, Irene saw her buying more straw and remarked, "People repair cabins, but you repair dirt?" Eleanor remained silent. She did not try to explain or convince anyone. The skepticism even reached the children. Valley kids started calling her Old Mole Woman because they heard adults say she was digging a burrow to live like a mole. Every time she passed a group of children playing near the church, Eleanor heard giggles behind her. But she knew arguing or getting angry would change nothing. She had lived too long in this valley to know people did not believe what they had not seen with their own eyes. And the more she was mocked, the more she worked, more quietly. The shovel strikes under the barn became steadier. The stones she stacked for walls were adjusted more carefully. In her mind, there was only one thing. The knowledge Matthew left could not be wrong. Ground temperature did not lie. And her son's death, the previous year, was the final warning that she could not rely on the wooden cabin for one more winter. She was not fighting the neighbors. She was only fighting the winter. The first night of winter arrived earlier than expected, with outdoor temperature dropping to around 15 degrees Fahrenheit and wind howling through every door crack, making the cabin tremble slightly. Eleanor's 2 grandchildren coughed in fits, the coughs echoing in the already freezing space, making her feel as if the cabin was losing heat faster every minute. The stove still burned, but warmth did not spread. The wooden walls were ice cold to the touch. That was the first night she truly felt the helplessness of the house that had been with the family for decades. When the clock struck around midnight, Eleanor decided to test what she had secretly prepared all summer. She wrapped an extra scarf, took an oil lamp, a thin blanket, and the old thermometer her husband had used in the ice house. She gently opened the trap door under the livestock barn and descended the temporary dirt steps. The cellar space was dark but quiet. She set the lamp on the stone floor, sat down, and listened. The earth's breath rose gently, steadily, not piercingly cold like the cabin air. She remembered Matthew's words. The earth breathes slower than the wind. Slower, but steady. When she hung the thermometer on the stone wall, the cabin above was at 43 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the fire still burning. But in the cellar, the thermometer gradually rose to 52 degrees Fahrenheit and stabilized at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, and most importantly, without any fire at all. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a space that did not make her shiver from cold. The space was small, low-ceilinged, rough stone walls, but the earth's warmth held steady like an old embrace that winter could not invade. She pulled the blanket closer, sat quietly a while longer, then placed her hand on the stone wall to confirm it was not an illusion. That stability, 52 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, without burning wood, was the number enough to keep children from freezing when winds dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And those very numbers made her cry from relief. "This is how to save the kids," she said to herself in the darkness, her voice trembling from emotion rather than cold. She knew the cellar still needed work. An extra insulation layer on the ceiling, more stone reinforcement in the northeast corner, and careful adjustment of the air vent to ensure no smoke buildup if she later lit a small fire. But from that moment, her belief completely changed. This was no longer an experiment. This was the only solution. She returned to the cabin as dawn neared, wind still howling through the wooden walls as a reminder. But this time, Eleanor no longer felt despair. She had touched a place winter could not control, and she would complete it before the true cold swept down the valley. The whitetail blizzard struck Dunwell Valley in late November, nearly a week earlier than usual. In just hours, winds exceeded 50 miles per hour, whipping even trees that had endured decades of snow. Temperature plunged from 5 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit so fast that water in buckets froze after one gust. Snow no longer fell straight but was driven sideways by wind, slashing faces like thin blades. Smoke from chimneys was forced back down, pouring into cabins, forcing many families to open doors in the cold to avoid suffocation. The entire valley was submerged in the dry howl of wind, mixed with the cracking snaps of large pine branches breaking. The Brennan family cabin burned bright all night as they burned a week's worth of firewood in hours to maintain heat. By midnight, Brennan had to chop old tables and chairs to keep the fire going. In the North Valley, old Kitteridge could not withstand the sudden cold either. He gathered all unnecessary furniture, wooden shelves, old door frames, even a moth-eaten cabinet, and threw them into the stove. Children in the valley coughed choking fits, lips turning purple despite 3 layers of blankets. Every household could only huddle close to the stove, watching the fire weaken and praying for the wind to shift. Eleanor's cabin was not spared the destruction. Just 2 hours after the storm began, already cracked wooden walls let wind blast through so strongly that the oil lamp flickered wildly. Smoke from the stove backdrafted and filled the house, making Eleanor cough non-stop while trying to keep the grandchildren away from the chimney. Each strong gust made the cabin door rattle as if the hinges would snap. Clara began struggling to breathe, her breaths short and wheezing, lips turning purple just like the night Jonas died. That image chilled Eleanor in a way the outside wind could not. She understood this cabin would not survive the night if the storm continued pounding. When the wind gusted so hard that the cabin ceiling could be heard vibrating, Eleanor made the decision she knew was life or death. She wrapped scarves around the 2 children, held them close, then opened the trapdoor and led them down into the cellar by the swaying oil lamp light. When the wooden cellar door closed above their heads, the howling wind noise dropped nearly in half. Eleanor spread thick, dry straw over the trapdoor to retain heat and muffle the wind, then wedged 2 logs to ensure snow could not leak in. She sat down, holding the children close, listening to the stark difference between 2 worlds separated by just a few feet of earth. Outside, the storm roared as if trying to tear the valley in two. But below, in the place she had spent all summer digging and building, there was no wind, no smoke, no cold piercing the stone walls. The temperature in the cellar stayed suitable, enough for Eleanor to feel warmth gradually spreading from the walls. Clara and Edwin lay on the dry straw bed, their breathing evening out. In just a short while, both fell asleep the first time in many nights of coughing, fever, and fear. Eleanor sat still, listening to the wind outside, trying to penetrate the earth but failing. In that moment, she knew her decision had been right. The shelter she had secretly built was keeping the 2 children safe, while the cabin above was becoming a deadly cold trap, and that first night of the whitetail blizzard became the turning point. There was no doubt left. Only one place in the entire valley that winter could not reach the very place where she sat. Eleanor's shelter began proving its worth after just one night, and in the days that followed, its stability became unbelievably clear. Even though outside temperatures swung between negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit and negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the shelter it held steady at around 62-64 degrees Fahrenheit, with only a small fist-sized fire. The thick stone walls she had carefully stacked one by one worked exactly as Matthew had once explained. The large stones absorbed and retained warmth, spreading it evenly throughout the space, leaving no cold corners. She checked by placing her hand on every corner of the walls. Nowhere was bitterly cold or damp. The flat stone floor with its gravel underlayer kept the surface dry, even when Eleanor boiled water or lifted pot lids. There was no condensation or cold moisture, the #1 enemy in a long winter. In those conditions, Daily life in the shelter was completely different from the cabin above. Eleanor used the small stove to heat thin soup, and the steam from the pot blended with the natural earth warmth, making the shelter more comfortable hour by hour. There was no piercing wind whistling through the walls, no smoke blowing back from the chimney into her face, no cold seeping up from the wooden walls or cabin floor. Each time she lifted a pot lid, the rising steam quickly dissipated into the air, proving the ventilation was working properly. The children sat on the straw pile, while Eleanor placed the small Bible on her lap and taught them to read letter by letter. The breath of the three of them, not much, but steady, also helped maintain the shelter's warmth. Every few hours, she only needed to add one small log, less than a quarter of the firewood the cabin usually burned just to stay at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, the cabins of families throughout the valley were struggling against the blizzard. Many homes, even burning whole piles of wood, could only manage 36 degrees Fahrenheit or lower when the wind shifted and forced smoke back inside. Brennan had his family huddle right next to the stove to avoid the cold. Kitteridge's eyes were red from smoke, yet he still had to keep a strong fire going so the cabin wouldn't drop to dangerous levels. In those circumstances, the contrast between traditional cabins and Eleanor's shelter became stark. In a cabin, a family burned nearly half their wood reserves in just 2 days. In the shelter, Eleanor used less than 25% of her firewood to maintain temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. She carefully recorded those numbers every day. She hung thermometers in 2 different spots, one near the shelter ceiling and one near the floor to measure any difference. When she saw the temperature only varied by 1–2 degrees Fahrenheit through the night despite the raging storm outside, she knew the shelter was functioning exactly as she had bet all her hopes on. The children's health also improved dramatically. Clara no longer shivered when she woke up, and her cheeks regained their pink color after weeks of pallor. Edwin, who had been coughing since the start of the season, now slept peacefully through the night without wheezing. Eleanor placed her hand on their foreheads each morning, checked their breathing, and each time felt a portion of her worry melt away. But that relief came with a lingering concern. She knew the neighbors would notice her cabin no longer had chimney smoke or lamplight leaking through the cracks. They would think she had vanished, or worse, that she had frozen to death in the cabin like many elderly people caught in sudden storms. She also worried the children would face stigma after this winter, once people learned she had taken them to live underground like burrow dwellers. But she had no other choice. Clara and Edwin's safety mattered more than gossip. She had lived long enough in the valley to know that people were quick to mock anything they didn't understand, but they would fall silent when faced with real results. This shelter might not convince anyone yet, but it would certainly keep her 2 grandchildren alive through the whitetail blizzard. And while the wind outside continued its endless howling, the old widow knew she had been right to rely on the earth's temperature, the one thing that never betrayed people in winter. For 3 straight days, Brennan saw no chimney smoke from Eleanor's cabin. In a winter when every family had to burn wood day and night just to survive, the complete absence of even a wisp of smoke could only mean one thing. Something bad had happened inside that cabin. No footprints leading out, no sound of a door, no lamplight glowing through the wood cracks at night. Brennan stood on his own porch, squinting into the negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit wind, his unease building by the moment. "I can't let her freeze to death like that," he whispered, then immediately threw on his fur coat and went to Kitteridge's to report the news. Within minutes, a small group formed. Brennan leading the way, Kitteridge carrying a lantern, Thomas Hale, the curious teenager, following close behind, and Irene Mulvaney, her face full of worry, tightening her wool scarf. They trudged through nearly 2 feet of snow, the wind whipping their faces and making every step heavier. Each of them had mocked Eleanor in one way or another, but now no one was thinking about laughing, only fearing they would find a stiff, frozen body inside that dark cabin. When the group reached the livestock barn, they stopped. Not a single animal stirred. No light. Everything was unnaturally silent. Brennan opened the barn door, the wood creaking in the wind. He raised the lantern and immediately noticed something strange. A sliver of light shining up from beneath the old wooden floor. "There's something down there," Thomas whispered. Brennan knelt down and held his hand near the crack. Warm air puffed up, startling him. Warm air. On a negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit night, no one spoke another word. The whole group pressed their ears to the floor. And then they heard it clearer than any sound in the storm. Children's laughter. Light, clear laughter, ringing steadily as if they were playing on an April afternoon. Irene covered her mouth, her eyes wide with astonishment. Kitteridge looked around the empty, cold barn and shook his head. Impossible. Brennan pushed the straw aside, his hands shaking from both cold and shock. A trapdoor appeared, so well hidden no one would have suspected it existed. He slipped his fingers into the gap and pulled hard. The trapdoor swung open, and a rush of warm air hit the group's faces so warm that Irene stepped back. "Good Lord," Brennan exclaimed. Below was not a hole to bury herself in, as people had cruelly joked. It was a space lit by lamplight, warm and dry. Sturdy stacked stone walls, a reinforced wooden ceiling. In the center of the shelter sat the elderly widow Eleanor, beside a small fire, her calm eyes looking up as the trapdoor opened. Next to her, Clara grinned broadly at the stunned adult faces, while Edwin held out his arms to show off the piece of wood he had just carved. None of them wore heavy coats. Clara was in just a thin sweater, yet rosy-cheeked. Edwin played on the stone floor as if in a warm kitchen. Irene burst into tears immediately. "Oh God, she's alive. The children are alive, and they're healthier than any kids in the valley." Kitteridge bit his lip, his cheeks red more from shame than cold. He had said the harshest words. "She's digging her own grave." Now he avoided Eleanor's gaze, his voice hoarse. I was wrong." Brennan stared down into the shelter longer, as if unable to believe his eyes. He nodded slowly, his voice firm like a confession on behalf of the entire valley. "All these years, we've been wrong about her." And from that moment, the story of the crazy old lady digging a hole under the barn completely changed direction. Just 2 days after Brennan's group discovered Eleanor's unusually warm shelter, the whole of Dunwell Valley began flocking to that old livestock barn as if it were the only place defying winter. People brought all sorts of tools, mercury thermometers, paper and pencils, measuring tapes, even hourglasses to time how long the fire could be out. No one mocked anymore. They came to verify and to understand how a 68-year-old widow had accomplished what generations in the valley had never thought of. The first test was temperature. Everyone carefully recorded the numbers. Brennan's cabin, despite constant stove burning, only held 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Kitteridge's was slightly better at 42 degrees Fahrenheit thanks to a wind shift. But when they lowered a thermometer into Eleanor's shelter and waited for the needle to settle, it jumped to 63 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there, as if completely unaffected by the howling blizzard outside. And what stunned the group even more, she had only burned 3-4 small logs, the kind that normally would just be enough to start breakfast. Those who had mocked her stood silent, watching the same reading repeated twice. 3 times. Every measurement identical. No one could speak. After temperature came structural checks. Brennan firmly knocked on the stone walls. The sound was solid and steady, no hollow or loose spots, proving her stone stacking created a durable thermal mass that also held weight well. Thomas Hale ran his fingers along the wooden ceiling and found no sagging or damp patches, even as the storm lashed snow outside like whips. Irene checked for moisture, holding her hand near the walls completely dry. Not a single drop of condensation, rare in any enclosed winter space. Kitteridge bent down to examine the cleverly hidden ventilation pipe in the barn wall, noting how she angled the exhaust against the wind to prevent snow entry. He shook his head slowly. An ordinary person wouldn't think of this. The most important test was duration. The neighbors agreed to extinguish the fire at noon and record changes over 6 hours. Brennan's cabin thermometer dropped from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 30 degrees Fahrenheit in under 90 minutes. Kitteridge's fell from 42 degrees Fahrenheit to 31 degrees Fahrenheit in just over 2 hours. Meanwhile, in Eleanor's shelter, the temperature only declined from 63 degrees Fahrenheit to 59 degrees Fahrenheit after 6 hours, just 4 degrees Fahrenheit lost. The farmers, who lived their whole lives by practical experience, needed no further explanation. The data spoke louder than words. A traditional cabin lost heat 4 or 5 times faster than her shelter. That meant less firewood, less risk, less illness, and far greater survival odds in any storm. After the measurements, for the first time the valley people sat down in front of Eleanor to listen to her explain instead of smirking behind her back. She pulled out the old notebook her husband had left about ground temperature and how ice houses maintained 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. She drew a simple circle for them, showing the soil layer 6 feet below the surface, where temperature stayed constant, whether summer reached 85 degrees Fahrenheit or winter hit -30 degrees Fahrenheit. She pointed to the stones on the walls and explained alternating stacking for better heat retention. She told why she dug in summer: softer soil, less water, and to keep neighbors from knowing, because if they knew, they would discourage, obstruct, or ridicule her. Everyone listened, like students finally grasping a difficult lesson. No one called her crazy, superstitious, or joked she was digging her grave. Respect came naturally, not because she was old and frail, but because the results were too clear to deny. At the end of the session, Brennan spoke for everyone. "Mrs. Hargreave, we want to learn. Tell us what to do, and we'll do it. For the first time in years, I feel hope." And in the dim lamplight, the old widow simply nodded, her eyes reflecting relief, mixed with the deep sorrow of someone who had lost too much to truly understand what winter means. The spread began just days after the verifications, when every measurement confirmed the same Eleanor's shelter maintaining 62-63 degrees Fahrenheit, using 75-80% less firewood than ordinary cabins. No one in Dunwell Valley hesitated any longer. Brennan acted first. He chose the area under his kitchen, the spot least exposed to wind and closest to water, and started digging a shallow shelter, following her exact guidance. 6 feet deep, tightly stacked stone walls, thick reinforced wooden ceiling with crossbeams. He panted constantly, being over 50, but every time he thought of his family huddled in a 39 degrees Fahrenheit cabin, he drove the pickaxe harder. Not far away, Kitteridge, the one who had mocked Eleanor the harshest, dug a small shelter right under his chicken coop. He only needed room for his 2 grandchildren, who had already turned blue-lipped 3 times this winter, coughed all night, and couldn't sleep more than 2 hours because of the cold. Irene Mulvaney chose a bold approach, partnering with 2 young neighboring families to dig a shared shelter twice the size of Eleanor's with 2 entrances. "More people hold heat better," Irene said, for the first time applying knowledge instead of rumor. From these first shelters, adapted versions began appearing throughout the valley. The Johnsons built a double shelter connecting 2 cabins with a short tunnel, in case a storm jammed the main door. The Donovan brothers dug a long shelter with direct access from the kitchen floor, avoiding outdoor travel in blizzards. Families with small children dug compact versions, just enough space for 2-3 kids to sleep at night, escaping the skin-cutting cold of wooden beds. At first, Eleanor had no intention of helping anyone. She thought the results spoke for themselves and didn't need her teaching. But within days, people knocked constantly. "Can you check if this stone wall is good? Is this soil too damp? Is the vent placed right? Is the thermometer reading accurate this way?" And so, the old widow became the reluctant advisor for all of Dunwell Valley. She went from house to house, slowly but surely. She showed them how to test soil moisture by squeezing a handful. If it crumbled, it was fine. If it stuck, add more gravel. She lent many families her husband's old thermometer from the 1860 ice house, teaching them to measure early morning for accuracy. She inspected wooden ceilings, tapping each plank to ensure no thin spots that could collapse. She noted details to help them avoid mistakes she herself had made. Walls too straight, causing hot air to pool in one corner, soil not fully dried, making walls sweat, vents angled wrong, letting cold wind rush in. The valley changed day by day. In just 3 weeks, more than 18 families had decent shelters. Temperature checks across the valley showed clear improvement. Most shelters held 58-62 degrees Fahrenheit, and cabins no longer needed constant fires. Valley-wide firewood use dropped over 60%, something that had never happened in any previous winter. But the most important result was with the children. No child suffered severe pneumonia that entire winter. No more lingering coughs from before dawn. No more nights parents stayed awake because their kids' lips turned blue. Those who had doubted her most, Brennan, Kitteridge, Irene, all openly admitted that without the old widow, Dunwell Valley would have lost far more than one family in the whitetail blizzard. And from then on, people no longer called her Old Mole Woman. They called her the one who kept warmth for the whole valley. When spring finally crept into Dunwell Valley, ice began falling in sheets from cabin roofs, and the black soil softened again. People looked around and realized the strangest thing. Through a winter of -30 degrees Fahrenheit, There had been almost no fatalities. No family lost anyone. No child lay bedridden with severe pneumonia. And at the center of that survival, people were grateful for what seemed an ordinary place, the shelter under the livestock barn of the widow Eleanor Hargreave. They told the story everywhere. Church, general store, even early planting gatherings. To many, her shelter seemed like a miracle. But those who had stood under the trap door and felt the 63 degrees Fahrenheit warmth rush up in a blizzard night knew it was no miracle, it was knowledge, the hard-earned learning of a woman mocked for years by this very valley. The community's change came faster than anyone expected. Those who had spoken the harshest words saying she was digging her grave, calling her crazy, claiming she was burying herself, now knocked on her door to thank her. Kitteridge, once the loudest skeptic, stood before her one March afternoon, hat in hand, offering an unhidden apology. Brennan brought the best bundle of firewood from his stock as a gift, though everyone knew spring had arrived and she no longer needed it. The valley children completely changed their tone. No one called her Old Mole Woman anymore, the teasing name that once made kids giggle behind her back. Now they called her Grandma Warm Cellar, the grandmother of the warm shelter that saved them through the harshest winter in decades. They ran to her asking how to choose stones, how to read the wind, how to test soil moisture, things even older men in the valley had to relearn from scratch. Many years later, when Eleanor had grown frail and could no longer go out to the fields each morning, the valley still made a habit of stopping by her old livestock barn to retell the old story. And so the next generation wouldn't forget that lesson. People erected a small wooden sign beside the barn wall, slightly tilted from rain and wind but sanded smooth and carefully lettered. Hargreave Warm Cellar, where one old widow kept warmth for the whole valley. The sign was no grand monument or stone marker, but it was enough for passing children to pause a few seconds, ask their parents who was she, and hear the story of the woman mocked, yet who saved a community through knowledge and perseverance alone. And in the final telling of the story, the narrator closes with the same spirit as the original script's message, a line anyone who lived through that winter understands deep in their heart. Not everyone who is laughed at is wrong. Sometimes the thing they do in silence is exactly what keeps us alive through the winter. If you enjoy survival stories rich with meaning like this one, please subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next stories.